Hi, Demarsh here. Please take 2 seconds to like, follow, share this channel. It helps us beat the algorithm. And also consider going to trendsjournal.com to subscribe. Every little bit helps us keep 100% independent. We refuse ads. We answer only to subscribers the way that news is supposed to be delivered. These are challenging times. These are changing times. And it's very important for you to consider staying ahead of the mainstream media. So please take 2 seconds and check out trendsjournal.com. That's trendsjournal.com. Thank you, as always, for your support, and stay safe. Hi, I'm Edmund Demarsh with the Trends Journal. I'm happy to be here today with Professor Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. Professor, thank you for joining the Trends Journal, as always.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I reached out to you before, and I showed you a post that Donald Trump made on social media, on Truth Social. It seemed as though we weren't hearing too much about Iran, with Greenland at the forefront, especially in Davos. That seems to have changed recently. That seems to have changed, and things seem to be speeding up very quickly. I'm going to just read what he posted in part on Truth. He wrote, "A massive armada is heading to Iran. They're moving quickly and with great power, enthusiasm, and purpose. It's a larger fleet, and it's headed by the great carrier Abraham Lincoln." He said, like with Venezuela, it is ready, willing, and able to rapidly fulfill its mission with speed and violence if necessary. Hopefully, Iran will quickly come to the table and negotiate a fair and equitable deal. No nuclear weapons, one that is good for all parties. He goes on from there. But, Professor, how do you read that newest message from Trump? And it seems like it's no longer about the protesters that he cares so much about.
Well, the whole affair about the riots, the deadly riots, was to bring us here. We now know that the U.S. Treasury Secretary in Davos, he admitted that the United States has been at work to bring down the Iranian currency. So when the currency fell, as I said in previous interviews, and perhaps with yourself as well, the Iranians knew that the Americans were behind it. But now the U.S. Treasury Secretary is admitting it himself. He's gloating about it. Then we had the peaceful protest for a couple of days. No arrests, no violence. The government actually praised the protesters and said your concerns, which were about the currency, are legitimate. But after a couple of days, we saw these very violent rioters, very well trained, very well organized, suddenly appear in different parts of the country and in different parts of major cities. And they began their deadly riots, for the most part, on the 8th and 9th of January. So the currency fall, the rioters and terrorists who were organized beforehand by the MEK terrorist cult, which fought for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s against their own country, the monarchists, whose leaders openly calling for the United States and Israel to bomb Iran, separatists, and the Takfiris, and the remnants of ISIS. These are the groups that were involved in the deadly riots. And then we saw really the entire Western media come out and suddenly talk about Iran and making up these fabricated numbers. Soon they'll be in the hundreds of thousands, despite the fact that the Israelis have taken responsibility. Mossad issued a statement in Persian saying their people are on the ground in Iran. The former head of the CIA, Pompeo, no friend of Iran, bragged about Mossad being among the rioters and the terrorists. And then, of course, most importantly, perhaps, is Israeli Channel 14, which is close to Netanyahu, saying that it was they, the Israeli regime, that brought in large amounts of weapons that led to the deaths of hundreds of Iranian police officers and security members. They said hundreds. Channel 14. Despite all that, and all the footage of the rioters killing and beheading and burning people alive and destroying hundreds of ambulances and fire engines and public buses and banks and so on, Western media pretends, whether it's The Guardian or Fox News, it doesn't matter, pretends as if these were peaceful protesters and that the Iranian government is slaughtering them at a pace where the Israeli regime would envy. So, when you look at that, it's clear that it was all pre-planned. So this is where we are supposed to be right now. with Trump threatening Iran. But I think actually his message is a bit ambiguous, or let's say it's a bit different from his previous messages. You're right. He doesn't talk about the protesters or rioters because they're not the protesters. The protesters left the scene earlier on. And also, he admitted back a few days ago when he backed down the first time that the two sides were shooting at each other, if you recall. So he did make that admission in the past, sort of to justify his stepping back from the abyss. But here he's talking about a nuclear bomb, whereas before he was talking about a host of different issues, Iran's uh, missile program, its missile defense program, and a host of other issues, and Iran's alliances across the region. That doesn't exist in this Truth Social. So is this a stepping back? Who knows? It's Trump. We can't say. Tomorrow morning I may wake up and find out that he has another absurd tweet. But Ed, the important thing that we should all keep in mind is that Iran is ready for war. And during the 12-day war with the Israeli regime, when they and the Americans conspired against Iran and carried out a blitzkrieg attack, Iran used a very small portion of its offensive military capabilities. This is something that people across the world really don't appreciate. Iran's capabilities against the Israeli regime are, I don't want to say a sideshow, but it's a small segment of its capabilities. Why? Because Iran has been developing a defense capability for the last 20-some years directed at the United States, not at the Israeli regime. Ever since the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and surrounded Iran, and Bush started saying all options are on the table, and then Obama continued to say all options are on the table, the Iranians have been building underground missile and drone bases across the country, but directed at the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. So they're full of short-range missiles and medium-range missiles that are easy to move around, much less expensive, and which will reach their destinations within a few minutes. And then they have hundreds of thousands of drones in underground bases across that region. Those drones can cross the Persian Gulf in a very short period of time, and they will move in swarms. And then the Iranians have underwater drones. They've been preparing for a war with the United States for a very, very long time. So the Iranian capabilities that are directed towards the United States are infinitely greater than the Israeli regime. And also taking into account that the world is so dependent on the Persian Gulf region, and that all of the countries or the regimes on the other side of the Persian Gulf host US bases, that makes them all complicit. So if Iran sinks tankers, if it destroys oil and gas installations, what Iran can easily do is that it can stop the oil and gas trade from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. And that would lead to a global economic meltdown that would make 1929 look like a recession rather than a depression. And this is at a time when the global economy is already beginning to fall apart. We see the rise in the price of gold and silver. It's a symptom of a very terrible economic situation, which is, I think, the heart of this crisis is the United States itself rather than the rest of the world. So the point I'm making is that Iran has enormous firepower. Iran is very powerful and resilient. Its religious and ideology, its culture make it resilient. And I would also add that putting all these on, together and then combining it with Iran's allies in Iraq and Yemen and elsewhere in the region, that would make the United States, its presence in West Asia, altogether unsustainable. And most probably, if there's a war, a lot of these tiny Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf region, they'll collapse.
One of the reasons why we read, at least in the West, and Trump decided against going to war with Iran last week was because there was intelligence that the regime that they call in the U.S. the regime was stronger than he thought. And so now, and Israel said, if you're going to attack, it needs to result in the end of the Iranian leadership, or if it can't, don't attack. Is there any evidence that the Iranian leadership is in a more chaotic state this week than it was the previous week? And if not, where is Trump getting this information that makes him think that this is a more viable strike than last week?
Well, you would know these things better than I, and you follow American politics more close than I do. But I think probably that he gets his information from the neocons and Zionists, and his White House is a Israeli first White House. The people surrounding him, their priority is Israel, not the United States. So a lot of that information could be coming from the very same people who are responsible for the deaths of the Americans protesting ICE in the United States. These radical and irrational fanatics. But I think it's anyone who understands our region and anyone who's been following the news in our region and is of my age or your age would understand that Iran has been on the verge of collapse ever since I remember, according to Western analysts and Western sources and Western unnamed intelligence figures. I mean, 16 years ago, Fareed Zakaria of CNN, and he attacked me on his TV show and said I'm a mouthpiece for a dying regime. Okay, his insults are a badge of honor for me, but it's been 16 years. That's a very slow death. And I personally think that there will be regime change in Washington before there's any regime change in Iran.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
I think that the United States under Trump is destroying the empire much more rapidly than previous administrations.
I know we don't have too much. Oh, I'm sorry. I know we don't have too much time now.
Sure. I just want to add that I think he's dragging it down much faster, but Iran's state institutions are strong. The constitution has shown itself to be very effective. And last time around, the Israeli regime murdered very high-ranking military officials. Iran still won the war. I don't see any circumstances where the United States could win a war against Iran.
I have two more questions, Professor. The first one is Scott Ritter, who we both know and like, was on an interview with Glenn Deason, and he told him that hypothetically, if he was giving advice to Iranians, the USS Abraham Lincoln would already be sunk. That's what he told Deason, because he said he's from the position that you don't wait to get punched in the face by your adversary. So based on his comment, of course, that was just his analysis and hypothetical. Do you see what's the likelihood, in your opinion, of Iran taking a preemptive strike while it sees this armada speeding towards it, with Trump saying that they plan on inflicting serious, fast violence? Do you see what's the likelihood, in your view, of Iran taking a preemptive strike somewhere in the region?
I wouldn't rule it out, but the damage that Iran could do to the United States is far greater than just taking out some, 40-year-old aircraft carrier. If Iran decides to shut down energy supplies from the Caucasus to the Red Sea, that would mean that the U.S. economy collapses. The global economy would collapse, but the world would blame the United States for pushing this conflict. I see no scenario where the Americans have an upper hand. The Persian Gulf region is extremely sensitive, and none of the entities on the other side of the Persian Gulf can claim innocence. And Iran can just send swarms of drones and missiles to take out all the installations. And the tankers and the ships. And what can a few THAAD or other air defense capabilities do against these hundreds of thousands of short range and medium range missiles and drones coming towards these installations? It's just not possible. So the US, if they initiate a conflict, they will be at Iran's mercy. And I have no doubt that it will be a war where the US regrets it far sooner than the Israelis began to regret the war. We know that during the 12-day war, during the last few days, the Israelis were seeking a ceasefire. They needed a ceasefire because they were losing the war, and Iran's attacks were becoming more painful and more devastating. This time around, Iran is A, ready for war. B, as I said earlier, its capabilities, for historic reasons, are directed at the United States. And C, the Persian Gulf is the most sensitive place in the world because the world needs the oil and gas in order to function. And some may say in the United States that, well, we're self-sufficient in oil. No, a few people will become billionaires because of the oil crisis. But people at the pump, people who need gasoline, people who be consumers who will be using energy for their businesses, for their homes, their businesses and their way of living, it will cease to exist. The US economy will collapse like everywhere else. So I think that Trump would regret a war in less than 6 days. He would probably regret it within the first 24 or 48 hours. And that is why the Iranians have sent multiple messages to the United States. The Americans have basically asked Iran to let us carry out a small strike, and then you carry out a small strike, and then we'll be finished. Iran said, no, you strike, and it's all out war.
My last question, Professor. As I said, I promised I wouldn't keep you too long. I can go on and on here and you talk about this. My last question is, I know you, in previous conversations, you said it's been Tehran's policy not to have to rely on the help of Russia or China or other allies. I know there was a very large naval drill between Russia, China, Iran, South Africa just recently. I don't know if it was this week. How does China sit this out? Because now the US controls the oil out of Venezuela, cutting Beijing off from that supply. If, let's say, this war begins, China could see its oil production from the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, really impacted. Does China start looking at this, saying, what's going on here? Is this similar to what the U.S. did to Japan right before World War II, where it chokes out a country that relies on oil supply to, especially for its military? I mean, if China doesn't get the oil from these regions, it'd be a difficult time running a military. What do you see China and Russia doing with this situation? Would they get a little bit more involved than we saw in Venezuela or other U.S. Conflicts recently?
Well, Russia and China are very worried about the behavior of the United States in general. And what happened in Venezuela is something that has made the Chinese and the Russians very angry. Iran, of course, is much different from Venezuela. Iran has capabilities that go far beyond the capabilities of that country. And I would argue, based on the fact that I have been to Venezuela a few times and I have close friends in Venezuela and I'm in daily contact with them, the United States hasn't taken Venezuela. And the narrative coming out from the White House or the State Department is one thing, but the reality on the ground is another. But Iran is far more powerful, and it has powerful regional allies, and the region is very sensitive. And yes, Russia and China are deeply concerned because if the United States has any success, that does not bode well for them. And ultimately, the United States wants to be the regime. Ordinary Americans are suffering from the empire as much as anyone else, increasingly, at least, if not as much, but increasingly to levels that are similar to many others who are suffering from the empire. But the Chinese are the ultimate goal. So they are concerned. Iran's relationship with Russia and China is very good. Iran purchases military hardware and software from its friends. just as it does the same with Russia and its military exports. So there is a significant level of cooperation, but also Iran has a very powerful and competent indigenous military industry. We saw that in the 12-Day War. All those missiles that struck Israel, they were Iranian. And the drones that were downed and the missiles that were downed by Iranian air defenses, most of those air defenses were Iranian made. Now, Iranian air defenses had enormous shortcomings, and that is something that's being worked on. But Iran's offensive capabilities are clear for everyone to see, and today they're much stronger, more effective. They learned from the war, and as I said, their real capabilities, the capabilities that are untouched and which are massive, are not the long-range missiles that we saw pound Tel Aviv and other places in occupied Palestine. They're the short and middle range missiles and drones which cannot be stopped, and they will cross anyone who looks at the map of the Persian Gulf will see that they will reach the other side very swiftly. There's nothing that can stop them.
Well, Professor Mohammad Marandi, check him out on X. We'll have a link down below. Professor, I'm sorry that we're in this state of the world. We talked briefly before the video, and I can't believe that this is where we are. I think everyone's just, there's like a dark pale, it seems like, over the world at the moment. That's at least what I feel here in Los Angeles, even. But
I agree, but Ed, the thing is that the reason why Iran is targeted is there are two reasons. One is Iran's independence, and which is unique in the world that we live in today. The second is its support for countries and peoples that have been resisting the empire, Venezuela being one of them. But the biggest reason, or the most important issue that angers the empire and the collective West, which pretends to care about human rights, the regimes, is the issue of Palestine and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And Iran is not going to forsake the people of Palestine. They've made that willful decision to be steadfast where others have failed to do so for reasons that go back in history. And Iran and its allies, they will remain steadfast. And I have no doubt that ultimately, if there is war, it will be painful for all, but it will not end well for the regime in Tel Aviv or its backers in the West.
Professor, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ed.